Jonathan, welcome into the back room.
Thanks, Andy. Great to be here.
So I want to talk about your book. It's called Yet Here I Am, Lessons from a Black Man's Search for Home. Congratulations. It's got a lot of critical acclaim and it looks to be a huge success. And congrats again on that.
Thank you.
So in this memoir, you describe navigating two very different environments growing up, one in New Jersey, another in rural North Carolina, which shaped your understanding of race and belonging. Can you share a moment from those years that still deeply resonates with you today?
Well, probably the biggest thing that resonates, well, there are two. There are two things. The first one being, you know, being born and raised up north in New Jersey, in Essex County, Newark, New Jersey, the initial years, and going to Catholic school from, first through fourth grade. And then spending my summers down south in rural North Carolina, where my mother grew up and my father, but with my maternal grandparents, and spending the summers there where my grandmother was a Jehovah's Witness. And so, two completely different religious instructions. But it was, going witnessing with my grandmother is how I started forming. And it wasn't until later years that I understood that going on those backcountry roads and sitting with those families that we sat with, and trying to spread the word of Jehovah with my grandmother, that I began to really understand race and our place in it, and my place in this country. The second thing is, and it really wasn't until I started writing this book and trying to put into context all those summers and what they meant. And it was then that I realized that I was born exactly 3 years to the day after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was enacted, and
Mm.
less than 2 years after the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And what those two laws did was bring African Americans into fully the American fold, had the US Constitution fully apply to Black folks in America. And what that meant was, as my cousin Rita and I were running around the yard in North Carolina, having fun, jumping in and out, through the sprinkler and with the toy wagon up and down the street. It wasn't until I was writing this book that I understood, that I realized that Rita and I were the first generation in our family that didn't have to pick cotton.
Mm.
Our parents did, our grandparents did. And, when our parents did it, it was to make money for the family. Previous generations had to do it, if not to make money, it was because they were enslaved. And so that's how those summers in North Carolina, they shaped me and who I am. But in later years, I understood that they shaped my worldview.
Talk about the holy black trinity of portraits and how, in terms of shaping,
Mhm.
the early exposure to that influenced your own sense of identity and purpose.
And so witnessing with my grandmother, we always, this is before Google Maps and GPS. Grandma, we always ended up going to the homes of Black people. And in these homes, and even at this young age, I noticed that almost always in these homes, always there were three portraits, sometimes four. And the Holy Black Trinity is Kennedy, King, and Christ. President Kennedy, because of what he did in supporting the civil rights demonstrations around the country. King, Dr. Martin Luther King, obvious. He was the spokesperson and the leader of the civil rights movement, the biggest one. And Jesus Christ, no need to explain. The fourth person is Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of President Kennedy, who was also the Attorney General of the United States. And his
Mhm.
presence on walls was significant. I didn't know this and understand it until I was reading Taylor Branch's book, Parting the Waters. It was RFK who pushed his brother, the president, to do right by civil rights marchers in the South. It was RFK who pushed governors to send in the National Guard to ensure that Black students were able to go to school, able to go to college. And so his presence on those walls was really very significant. And after reading Taylor Brancher's book, I understood that uh, without RFK, President Kennedy would not have been as courageous as history shows him to be.
I love this book for a lot of reasons. It really resonated with me on a lot of levels. But one of the main reasons I loved it is because, unlike a lot of authors who pen memoirs, you chose not to sanitize your memoir. Instead, you embraced vulnerability. There was really unfiltered storytelling. I mean, you admitted that if not for the serial killer thing, Jeffrey Dahmer was your type. I mean, that's pretty awesome. I mean, to admit that, that's great. I read that and I was like, all right, I like this guy. What motivated you to resist the usual memoir polish and go deep into the messy parts of your life?
I can point to three authors. The first one being Katharine Graham, the legendary former publisher of the owner of the Washington Post. And her memoir, Personal History, was just so compelling to me because here was this woman, the most powerful woman in journalism at the time, one of the most powerful people in America at the time, writing a book that was so open and honest and vulnerable about her relationship, her fraught relationship with her mother, her what it was like for her to, live through the aftermath of the suicide of her husband, who was the owner and publisher of the Washington Post, writing about her insecurities, what she didn't know, and her fears of failure in running the Washington Post. She puts it all out there. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. A woman of her stature doing this. This is an incredible book. 20 years later, Charles Blow, then a columnist at the New York Times, wrote Fire Shut Up in My Bones. And same thing, open, honest, vulnerable about his upbringing, his life, first as a straight man, married, kids, and his journey to coming out as bisexual. Reading his book finally made me understand where all that passion, fire, if you will, in his New York Times columns, where that came from. And then the third is a dear friend of mine. Charles Blow is a dear friend of mine, but so is Richie Jackson and his book, Gay Like Me. And it's his, a letter from a gay father to his gay son. And we were staying with them at their house in East Hampton, Richie and his husband, Jordan Ross. And we were sort of commiserating over the writing process. And I was just in the beginning stages. And he said to me, Jonathan, put yourself on every page. You have to put yourself on every page so that the reader sees you and knows you are there, and they get a real sense of you. And so having those three muses with me as I was writing was really helpful. And I felt there was no other way for me to write this book. I had to be open and honest and vulnerable because I wanted the book to be true. And the only way you can do that, and I wanted people to see my story, but also see themselves, if not in my entire story, at least in parts of it, the experiences that I had, the lessons that I learned. And the only way you can do that is if you are willing to put yourself on every page.
Yeah. And readers get that or they don't very quickly. Talk about your Uncle McKinley for a moment and share with us what he did for you that helped shape the course of literally the rest of your life.
So the one thing you have to understand is that in my family, there are, at the time when I was saying to everybody, I want to be a news commentator, there were no journalists, no writers, no authors, no one in television, no one in television news. And so when my Uncle McKinley, who worked at NBC as an electrician, said, turn on the Today Show, They're doing something on the plaza. I'm going to try to find the camera and wave. So I started watching the Today Show. And, I was a tattletale in my family, huge tattletale. And so here I am watching this news program where people got paid to tell other people's business, tattletale. And so I thought, wow, this is incredible. And so I just started telling, and I was about 10 years old. And so I started telling everybody, I'm going to be a news commentator. My fast forward to I'm in New York City for my Carlton interview, and it was at the New York Hilton, and which is only a few blocks north of 30 Rock. So I called my uncle and said, "Hey, I'm just up the street. Can I come visit?" And whenever I called and said, "Can I come visit?" he said, "Yes." And on this particular day, I get there and he says, I have work to do in the nightly news office. Do you want to come?" And he obviously knew the answer. And I won't belabor the story here. You can read it in the book, but it was that going with him to that nightly news office led to an internship the next year on the Today Show, which led to another internship the next summer on the Today Show, which led me to the career that I have now. And it's all because my uncle McKinley, who could have easily said, "Look, I'm busy. You
Right.
visit too much. Don't bother." And instead, my uncle, knowing how much I loved that building and loved news, knew how important it was to me to just walk the halls, breathe the air, even see the people I watched on television and what that would do for me, knowing full well that he had no idea, and neither did
Mm.
my mother, no one in my family knew how to help me. But in hindsight, they obviously, the one thing my uncle McKinley did was never say no.
Mm.
And also just being a one of the most decent people I've ever known, the quintessential man, someone who cared about other people and looked out for them. And then, my mother did something extremely important that that parents should not underestimate. When I'm going on about my dreams and what I want to do and what I want to be when I grow up, and knowing full well that there are no people in our family doing what I'm saying that I want to do, my mother never said, "You can't." She
Mm.
never planted seeds of doubt. Neither did Uncle McKinley, no one in my family. And I say to parents, never underestimate the power of your words on your children's dreams or on your nieces and nephews' dreams or your friends' dreams. They have power. And so my uncle McKinley, by saying yes that day, gave me probably one of the most incredible gifts that I could possibly have gotten.
Yeah, he was a true champion for you. You write a lot about Bryant Gumbel. Share with us why he was such an inspiration to you coming up in the news business.
So here I am, this kid saying, "I'm going to be a news commentator." At no point did I have any doubt that I could do the job, or that I would, eventually do that job. But it wasn't until Tom Brokaw was replaced by Bryant Gumbel on the Today Show, my favorite show. And here comes this guy who looks like me. And now I'm like, okay, it's real. It's on. I can do it because there's someone in that chair who looks like me. And so he became my idol. And so just imagine you're this kid with this big dream, and you are suddenly working on the show with your hero, with your idol. And that's what I got over 2 summers. But my relationship, as I write in the book, in my head was super complicated. And so, he would walk by me in halls and not say anything. And, I was, as I write, the ghost of annoying interns present. And so the next summer, I'm standing on the set, and I made sure I was on the set every day, 7:30 a.m. The show started at 7 and ended at 9 then. And I was on the set standing, watching everything at 7:30. The end of that first day of my second internship, he's walking off the set. And I was like, you know what? He doesn't even know I'm alive. I'm not going to talk to him, not going to acknowledge his presence. And he walked by me, didn't say anything, and I felt the snub, what I thought was a snub in my soul. If I could have crumpled to the ground, I would have. But a nanosecond later, I feel this tap on my back, and he says, "Welcome back."
Mm.
And in that moment, it was like, oh my God, he sees me. My hero
Mhm.
sees me. He knows I'm here. He knew I was coming back. This is incredible. And I write in the book about this assignment I was given, to go through his legal pads of interviews and put cover sheets on them, and you know, total busy work, right? But I didn't just look through things and type up notes. I read those interview questions and how he wrote them down. And as a result of that, I was able to get into his head and how he did interviews, how he conducted interviews. And that was 40 years ago almost. And what I learned 40 years ago is what informs how I do interviews and how I conduct myself as a journalist to this very day.
Another thing in the book that I think is so inspirational is that you knew so early on what you wanted to do with your life, even right down to where you wanted to do it, which is kind of crazy. And so I think it is so important for people who read that, and especially if young people read it, to see that you can map out your future and then do the things, to make it happen. What a gift to have that kind of clarity so young.
Well, as I've gotten older, Andy, what I realize is I'm not the rule, I'm the exception. That a lot of people don't know what they want to do. And actually, that's fine. That's okay. It took me a long time to understand that and to realize that the idea that I knew what I wanted to do, even though I didn't have a roadmap for how to get there, the fact that I had a North Star is
Mm,
what made it possible. I kept my focus on that North Star, even when I made deviations off the path. It was that North Star that kept me grounded. And so when I talk to young people, when I talk to, just audiences, I tell them, you know, success is however you define it. And what drives you, it could be a profession. For me, it was getting into news broadly, but television news in particular. But for other people, it might not be professional. It could be avocational. It could be something that just drives them, volunteering or coaching or doing something that gets you out of bed and motivates you. And, for a lot of people, folks have dreams and aspirations, and far too often, those hopes and dreams and aspirations are beaten out of folks
mm.
through negative words, negative questions like, how are you going to do that? Or what makes you think you can do that? Or the one that really irks me is, well, don't get your hopes up.
Right. God, I
It
hate that
sounds
too.
it sounds nice and benevolent. This person cares for you and they want to make sure your expectations are in check. That's not good for hopes and dreams. Hopes
No,
and dreams should not be held in check. You should absolutely get your hopes up. Because imagine
exactly.
what happens if you actually get what you want. And I have a couple stories in the book. One of the lessons I say is when someone asks you what you want, tell
Hmm.
them. You never know what the answer will be. And twice I was asked what I want, and twice I got the answer back, which was yes.
Yeah, such an important lesson. I want to take you back in time a little and have you, as viscerally as you can, explain to me in the moment what you felt when you walked through the doors of the White House with your mother for the first time, and also the first time you did it when she got to meet the Obamas.
So by the time I went to the White House with my mother for the first time, I had already been there once before for a smaller dinner, about 120 people for the National Medal of Arts and National Humanities medal winners, where there's a dinner in the state dining room. and I was seated at the president's table. And I tell
Mm.
that story in the book. Less than a year later, I'm invited, and that was in 98. 1999, I believe it was, I'm invited back to the White House for a state dinner. And it was a state dinner for the president of South Africa, Mbeki. And so I bring my mother with me. And I say to her before we leave the apartment where we were staying to get ready, and I was like, Mom, listen, this this is going to be work for me. I'm just starting to do TV. There are going to be lots of journalists there. There are going to be a lot of famous people there. I need you to understand that we cannot be running around taking pictures with everybody and all of that. My mother said, "Oh, right, yeah, we can't act like we've never been anywhere." And I said, "Yes, that's exactly it. Great." We get to this dinner, and at the time, it was the largest state dinner President Clinton had ever done. And um, my mother lost her mind. Everywhere she looked, you know, there's Jesse Jackson, there's John Lewis, there's Harry Belafonte. And then every once in a while, Black history, Black history. And then she started, okay, take my picture, take my picture, take my picture. We ended up getting into an argument in the tent on the South Lawn. Of course, this is after we go through the receiving line and we are announced. And introduced the president to my mother, and oh my God, it's so wonderful to meet you. Your son likes to come here from time to time. Moves us down to the first lady, Hillary Clinton, who says about my mother, she can't be your mother, and says to Mrs. Mbeki, this is Jonathan's mother. It couldn't possibly be. She looks so young. And of course, my mother's giggling and swooning. And, I tell this story in the book as the setup to my mother's. By the time I bring her to the White House for the first time to meet the Obamas, who by then had been in the White House, I believe, 3 years. She was an old pro, right? But my mother was now about to meet people she never thought would ever live there. The first Black president with his Black wife and Black daughters living in the White House for a girl who grew up in rural North Carolina to now be in the position to meet them was just something she just, it, it was not possible. So as we're going through, the Marine comes through and he gets your announcement cards and he asks, do you want these names to be said? And he asked if she wanted all three names said. And she said no. And I said, please say all three names. And my mother said, no, please just say my last name. And I looked at the Marine and I said, please say all three names. Thank you.
Mm.
And he walks away, knowing full well, get out of there. And my mother asked, why are you so insistent? And I said, Mom, I want the family name said in the White House. I want the President of the United States to hear the family name. She said, oh, I get it. I get it now. We snake our way
Mm.
through and we go into single file in the way that we're going to be introduced. And she's standing behind me. Something said, just turn around, check in on her. And I looked, and the look on her face, I tried to describe it in the book, and I don't know if I did it justice, but I write that she was transfixed on the Obamas. And the look on her face, it was as if she was looking at two unicorns,
Mm.
something she never thought she would ever see or that even existed. And there she's looking at them. And when we finally are announced and we say hello and we take the official picture says it all. The look on her face, she is beaming. And as I write, you know, she is with among the unicorns and she is
Mm.
in awe. And there's one more story that I'm not going to get into, but at the end, it sort of shows how when you act like you've never been anywhere, it is the most fun the most alive you will ever be.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing that you were able to bring her there and for her to be able to experience that. How does being a Black gay journalist inform or shape the stories you tell and the news that you cover?
Well, I mean, it's everything. And I should say at the outset, answering your question, those two identities are vital because I am an opinion writer. I'm a journalist. I do reporting. I call up sources, but the great honor and privilege that I have as an opinion writer is I get to say what I think about the reporting that I've done. And in a lot of instances, um, telling personal things about myself makes it possible for the reader to gain better understanding, because what's the best way to get people to understand a situation? It's through someone else. And when you're an opinion writer, especially these days, people are looking for trusted sources. And so when we were going through the shootings and killings of unarmed African Americans, particularly men, for a lot of people, I was probably the one African American they knew, and I'm particularly thinking of, the white audiences that I reach. I was the one person who they could turn to understand why was the killing of Trayvon Martin so traumatic for Black people who didn't even know him or weren't related to him. Oh, Jonathan's writing about this. So, you know, he's African American. He writes about these things. Let me read what he has to say. And for me, as an opinion journalist, that is the coin of the realm when people turn to you for understanding. And so, as a Black journalist, as an out gay journalist, going through the fight for marriage equality and all the things we went through during the Obama years and what we're going through now, I saw myself unwittingly or wittingly as a Sherpa for a lot of people to understand what was happening in their country.
Mm. My last question. You just left the Washington Post after almost 2 decades. I imagine that was an incredibly difficult decision.
Yeah, it was 18 years, 5 months, and 16 days,
Mm.
and an incredible platform where I was able to interview some of the most amazing people in the country and the world. I had a platform. I got up every morning and thought, what do I want to write about today? And then write it, and then file it, and then have it go out into the world, and then do it all again the next day. And so, it didn't hit me that I'd been there for nearly 20 years until I started reading the stories about Jonathan Capehart, who was at the Washington Post for nearly 2 decades. I was like, I need to sit with myself for a moment. It was hard. It was difficult to make the decision to leave. But on the other hand, the Washington Post made the decision easy by changing the direction of the opinion pages. Um, And though, to be quite honest, they offered everyone in the opinion section a buyout. And so I looked at all the factors and decided, I I know that what I write about does not fit into the twin pillars of personal liberties and free markets. And I know from, the video put out by the new opinions editor that I don't fit the vision. And so it was time. It was time to go. And so now I find myself thinking, do I go to another place to write? Do I go to Substack? Or do I not go anywhere and just um, do my television show on MSNBC and, Brooks and Capehart on PBS every Friday? As one friend said to me just a couple days ago, you know what? 18 years is about the time an academic goes on sabbatical. Maybe you should think of this as a sabbatical. And I thought, you know what?
Not a bad idea.
You might be right. But on the other hand, Andy, so many things are happening in our
Yeah.
country right now where I feel compelled to maybe not write as often as I did, maybe go on a half sabbatical. I don't know. But, you can't spend this much time uh, in this profession and writing the way I write and seeing everything that is happening in the world and then take a step back. It doesn't, as much as it might sound right, it doesn't
Mhm.
feel right.
Well, you will trust your instincts, which have done really well for you so far. Jonathan, again, the book is Yet Here I Am, Lessons from a Black Man's Search for Home. It's a terrific book, folks. Go get it. There's so many critically important life lessons in there. And Jonathan, you're right. There is a lot of stuff happening out there, and I hope you'll come back and talk with me again soon and we can talk politics.
Absolutely. Andy, thank you so much.
All righty. Take care.